All right, so good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Mehlaka Samdani. I'm the Executive Director of Critical Connections. It's a nonprofit organization here in the Valley which offers analysis and opportunities for dialogue around issues related to Muslim communities. Our event today is part of the Transforming This Moment series, which examines the cultural, social, political, religious, and racial divides that impact our communities, and also focuses on the transformative power of the individual to address those divides. And so we are very lucky to have an amazing speaker who you'll hear more about in just a little bit. Our event series is co-sponsored by our partner, the Karuna Center for Peace Building, and it's an international peace building organization. You'll hear more about that organization from Jenny McKenna, who is their board member, and you'll hear from her later in the program. And the series is also funded by Mass Humanities, which is a foundation based in Northampton, and whose grants inspire considered thought, conversation, and action. And so for our event today, we are extremely delighted to welcome and host Dr. Peter Coleman, who is here all the way from New York, and to give us his insights and expertise on how to approach the various divides that are afflicting our communities at the current moment. To give a more elaborate introduction and to contextualize the program, I will now hand it over to Bernal Pelletier, who is the Program Director at Critical Connections, and will moderate the discussion today. So thank you, Bernal.
Thank you, Melika. I'm going to try to put this back.
By the way, guys, was the sound okay? Was
Yeah, it's good. It's fixed now.
And that's okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, let me say that your attendance here tonight, among other things, has somewhat restored my faith in humanity, because somewhat. Not all the way. We have a ways to go, but we have 2 hours, so let's see what we can do. In our session, Transforming This Moment, this season we've had a neo-Nazi, we've had a Muslim extremist, so we've explored the ridges of the divide, and those were very well attended. And so as Melika and I thought about getting essentially a doctor who at least purports to be able to bring these peoples together and solve intractable problems, we said, I wonder if our population will go for something that's constructive and not just sensational. And I want to thank you for proving me, the doubter, wrong. We are indeed fortunate to have Dr. Coleman. I've been fascinated by him since this book, which he hasn't signed for me yet, but he will before the evening is out. In 2011, and it's called The 5%, Solving Intractable Problems. And as a thesis, he looks at interstate problems and notes that 5% of them are in many distinct ways different than the other 95%. And that people of goodwill, and I hope we have some people from both sides of the political divide. Often we attract to the liberal side of the divide. But often people of goodwill in these intractable situations employ the here's some chocolates, dear, here's some flowers, dear, some let's be nice and get along, dear, approaches, and they don't work. So Dr. Coleman's going to take us into some of the science. And let me tell you a little bit about his background. And I have to read this because it has a lot of big words and they're strung together. And there's no or here, everything is and. He is professor of psychology and education at Columbia University, where he holds a joint appointment at Teachers College and the Earth Institute. He directs the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution and the Institute for Psychological Science and Practice at the Teachers College, and is executive director of Columbia University's Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity, known to his friends as AC4. He currently conducts research on conflict intelligence, and I love this phrase, systematic wisdom. We could use a lot of that, as competencies for navigating conflict constructively, including a focus on adaptive negotiation and mediation dynamics, cross-cultural adaptivity, optimality of motivational dynamics in conflict, justice and polarization, multicultural conflict, intractable conflict, and we're to the end. And at the end of all that, and sustainable peace.
Good luck.
This is the short bio. So there's a lot that goes on with Dr. Coleman. So Dr. Coleman, thank you so much.
Congratulations on articulating all of those titles.
Actually, twice today I got through this. So. We thought we would start as a backdrop. Does anybody here think we're polarized as a society?
Just a touch.
It seems we are politically more polarized than ever. Maybe the Civil War, when there was actually bloodshed and trenches, I think we were more polarized then. But Doctor, can you talk about how we got here? What it means to be polarized? What are some of the dimensions of this? And what does science tell us about? We all know how we feel. But when you look at us as lab rats, what do you see?
Well, thank you for having me. It's nice to be here. It's always fun to visit Amherst. I just had some great Amherst coffee, so I'm very happy to be here and well caffeinated. I think clearly this is a time where we feel like we are an extremely polarized nation, and I emphasize that we feel that way because it depends on what you're measuring, which would tell us how polarized we are or are not. So we are polarized in certain dimensions. Congressional voting is one. So if you look at the history of congressional voting, since about 1980, 1981, votes in Congress and Senate have not crossed party lines more and more. So we're almost at a complete opposition of voting where you don't see people cross the aisle. So on that dimension, we are more polarized at the leadership in Washington. We're not polarized on specific issues. So if you look at gun control, if you look at attitudes on abortion, if you look at some of the more hot issues, you see a sort of normal curve. You see basically most of the people in the middle and some extremes. So you don't see a split in those, ironically. And that's been fairly stable for several decades on most of these hot button issues. Party affiliation, Democrat-Republic affiliation, and the strength of that affiliation has also been pretty stable for several decades, so we're not actually more extreme in our party affiliation. And also in our ideologies, whether we see ourselves as liberals, progressives, or conservatives, that's stayed fairly stable as well. So I know it feels like we're farther apart, but on some dimensions, the data doesn't suggest that that's so. But in other dimensions, it does. Congressional voting is one. The other way that we've really begun to split and separate is that the issues that are affiliated with one side or the other are very correlated. So if you're green, you tend to be, pro-choice, and you tend to your issues tend to line up and cluster. So in that way, the country is kind of splitting into camps in that any one issue for you associates to other issues like it, and that's sort of our team, spirit. We really feel like we're members of a team. So in that way, we're split. And in terms of the likability, so since 1948, they've done these post-presidential election polls, and they've tracked how we feel about our own group and how we feel about the other group. And we are at a time when more Americans feel a strong sense of loyalty for their own group, for progressives and liberals, Democrats, however we see it, strong sense of loyalty, and more of a sense of contempt of the other. We see the other as unintelligent, selfish, and a threat to our society. So those basic emotions and the emotions which then tie together all these issues, which used to be more separate. We used to have conservatives that would be liberal on some dimensions. We'd have liberals that would have some conservative positions. So people used to be more eclectic. Now we cluster, and we have this deep sense of really sort of personal disdain that is growing. And that is the most alarming piece of this, because emotional dynamics are central to our decision-making processes. We were just describing this, that there's research, there's brain science research where they study people who've had accidents and had parts of their brain have been severed, and they study people that can't experience emotions. And when we can't experience emotions, we can't make important decisions, because decisions are fundamentally emotional. Do you feel good about something? Do you feel negative about something? And when that is removed, we just can't process the information and we can't come to decisions. So these emotional experiences are fundamental to the information we pay attention to, right? We select certain information that bolsters our arguments and makes us feel good about our group and supports the negativity of the other group. But it also ultimately affects all of our decisions. So fundamentally, what is happening is sort of an emotional dynamic. And that's in some ways the good news and the bad news, right? The good news is that if you actually look at the issues, and if you actually look at things like party affiliation and ideology, the data doesn't suggest that we're that split. But in other ways, clearly we feel that way. And as the complexity of our society becomes simpler, so that it's our camp and their camp, that becomes a more and more difficult problem to address.
You know, one of the revelations I've had today, after talking to you for a few hours now, I'm a fact-based guy. By training, I'm actually an actuary. Some of you might want to leave just as soon as you hear that, I suppose. But to me, facts have always been primary. And who did I like on Star Trek? It was the guy with the pointy ears, or Data for the younger folks. And in these conversations that I've been having, they've been fact-based, and they don't work. And what I'm starting to, any other analytics in the audience, or are you all? There's got to be
numbers people.
There's got to be a few numbers. There's got to be a few. I think that's part of my own personal issue with this divide. Is emotions are much more important than I've ever let on, and even Mr. Spock knew that in 1960. But I'm catching up.
So can I just pick up on that for 1 second?
Please.
So I think that's right. We had a conversation over dinner about this, that in these kinds of times where there are these emotional camps that we, sort of tribal camps that we feel an allegiance to, when we engage with the other, when we engage in conversations or dialogue or debate with the other, bringing facts and figures and statistics usually has very little impact, unless the conditions are set where people can hear. So if you're having a conversation at your Thanksgiving table with someone where there's a sense of enmity, hostility with the other side, then you're not going anywhere, because they're not listening to your information. They're disregarding your information as fake news, or however they want to see it. And you as well think that they're, again, either unintelligent or really misinformed, and so you're not open to information. I was saying that there are two types of communication. One is persuasion, and when we try to persuade other people, we sort of narrow our focus. We really look at the logic. We look for places to have counterpoint flaws in their argument. So that's what we're paying attention to, and it's different from what we call dialogue. And dialogue is a process of kind of opening up and revealing your own vulnerabilities, your own not knowing, and being open to learning together, right? It's a very different kind of process. And under those conditions, if you can set up those conditions, then people can hear new things, and they can learn about your experience and how it's different from their experience, or how it's similar to their experience. But if you're locked into a battle, and it's a battle of facts and figures, you're not having, generally speaking, you're not having much impact on them, and they're probably not having much impact on you.
And one thing I found in talking is that you come at this from a science standpoint. So you're a psychologist and an educator. But around you, you've assembled a team that consists of hard scientists and social scientists. And maybe, if you would, talk a little bit about, I think it's your DST, your team, your science. Interestingly, your science is a lot more fun than my science. You've got couples therapy and that sort of thing. And then, if you would also, as you talk about that science, just explain this idea of an intractable problem, what it is, how you came to diagnose it, and I'd like everybody to leave with an idea of how it's different and why the world we're in may not be as obvious as at least I've been thinking it is.
Sure. So I study conflict and conflict resolution processes, how to negotiate, how to dialogue, how to mediate other people's problems. That's what I've studied for 25 years. And we know a fair amount of how to do that most of the time, how to bring people together who have different interests and different concerns, and how to get them to de-escalate, talk to each other, and respect each other. But there are some times with some kinds of conflicts, particularly when conflicts become around identity or a sense of injustice, that those kinds of processes don't help much, right? And some of those become what we call intractable. And intractable conflicts are, defined as things that last too long, and even with many good faith attempts to work them out, they just persist. So Israel-Palestine is the sort of, poster child of intractability, but it's happened in my family. My wife's cousin and I engaged in a long-term intractable conflict, just recently reconciled, by the way, but it was a long-term problem. And so it happens in families, it happens in organizations, it happens in communities all the time, and it happens obviously in Washington and between nations. And so those are the things that we studied, and the book is called 5% because in the international space where you look at state-to-state relationships over 200 years, you see that a very small percentage of the more difficult relationships become intractable, which means that for 40, 50, 60, 100 years, you have nations that are organized in ways they're suspicious of each other, they're trying to undermine each other, they will sometimes go to war with each other. It's like the Soviet Union or Russia and the United States in that relationship, these long-term antagonistic relationships that may escalate and de-escalate a little bit, but they're stuck in these patterns. And despite the fact that leaders change and policies change and there's all kinds of change that takes place over 50, 100 years, you still see these ensconced patterns in these things. And again, those happen in families all the way, scale it up into the international community. So that's something that we started to study, 10, 12 years ago. We got some funding from some people that were willing to fund a bunch of crazy people with a half-baked idea. And so we brought this team together, which was, we have an astrophysicist and an anthropologist and a political scientist and some psychologists. It was an eclectic motley crew. And what we try to do is take new insights from applied mathematics, from complexity science, which is the study of complex systems. And complex systems can be how cellular behavior changes, how a healthy cell moves in a quick way to a cancerous cell. So you see a qualitative shift in the system, right? Or it can be a long-term conflict in a community that gets stuck. So people apply different metaphors and ideas from mathematics, but then ultimately they also apply the mathematics to try to understand how these things work and when they do change. And so that's the metaphor that we use in this book is a metaphor called an attractor. An attractor is something from applied mathematics, and all it means is if you measure something over time, sometimes you see strong patterns emerge. So John Gottman, who is a colleague who works with these kinds of ideas, has done marital research out of his love lab in Seattle for about 30 years. Some of you may be familiar with his work. He's worked with thousands of couples. And by the way, marital research and marital therapy has the lowest satisfaction rate of anything because there's so many people that say, well, I was married 4 times, I can do therapy, come on in. And so there's not much science behind a lot of that work. But he and his spouse for 30 years or so have come up with very sophisticated mathematical equations, which probably sounds a little terrifying, but that they can predict. They bring couples into their lab. They have them talk over something that is conflictual for them. Usually it's sex or money, because that's what we fight about. And they record about an hour-long conversation between them. And once they code the emotional content of that conversation, they can predict within 97% whether the couple will be divorced or not in 5 years. 97% predictive. Psychology doesn't have that kind of power. Physics has that kind of power. So when you have that kind of predictive process, it's very telling. What they find in their lab is that couples fall into attractor patterns. And that just means that if you brought a couple in and they talked for an hour, you see that they're how they feel about each other clusters in a couple of patterns. And if you bring them in a week later, you see the same patterns. And if you bring them in a year later, you see the same patterns. They're patterns that resist change, and they kind of draw us in. So I like to talk about siblings because I think that's more resonant for many of us. If you think about when you get together with your siblings, the dynamics of your siblings tend to stay pretty stable for decades, right? So I'll go back I have 5 brothers and sisters, and the pecking order is still the same. My little brother, who worked for Clinton, still sits in the corner and doesn't say anything because he shouldn't. The dynamics are so stable. Those are attractor patterns. And they're determined by a lot of different things, but they basically are patterns that draw in how we think and feel and act, and sometimes draw in norms and institutions that keep them intact. So the divides in our country that have been taking place, particularly in Washington, are affected by a lot of different things, but ultimately they constrain how people behave, they constrain how people vote, and they constrain what they feel like they can think and say and do, right? And those are attractor patterns. So those are the ideas that we've been trying to work with. And we have mathematicians who really know what they mean and know what that means about change. Because so we can describe why these conflicts don't change, right? Because both basically they're affected by many things that feed each other in unpredictable ways that really create this culture which is unable to change. And so you change any piece or 2 or 3 of it, and it doesn't matter because there are too many other things that will compensate for it and bring it back, right? So we've been studying these things mathematically. We've been studying them in the lab. We have what we call our moral conflicts lab. We bring people into the laboratory. We match them on opposing attitudes on issues like pro-life, pro-choice. And then we have them have conversations. And while they're in the lab, we measure them. We measure their physiology, we measure their emotional content, how they feel during the conversation, we measure how they think, how the degree of complexity, nuance in their thinking. So we measure all these things over time. And what we see is when people have these moral conflicts in the lab, many people naturally go to a place where there's disdain, right? They crash. They think in very simple us-them terms, they feel strong negativity, and they ultimately just defend their position. But there are other people that get into these moral conflicts. Remember, you're in a room with someone who is morally opposed to you on some important issue. And some people are able to stay in an emotional place where they feel a lot of different things. Some of it's negative because they're taking the other side, but they can also think, well, that's an interesting point, or they can feel good about a point they make. So their emotional experience is more complicated. Their thinking is more complicated, and how they treat each other is a little bit more nuanced. And they end up in places where, no, they don't solve the issue of pro-life, pro-choice, but they walk out and they say, I'd have that conversation again. I would meet with that person again and have that conversation. And that's a start on this dimension. So, and that is ultimately about the complexity of those patterns. Whether we fall into these strong, kind of simplistic, us-them, emotional, cognitive, and behavioral dynamics, or whether we can somehow mitigate that and stay in a place that's a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more complex. And I tell you, under these conditions, it's hard to do. We were just joking about, I do the same thing when I watch the news. So I spent the whole summer, I feel like I have an intimate relationship with Anderson Cooper and Rachel Maddow, like I know everything about them now. And I didn't, a year ago. Spent a lot of the summer watching them and then moving over to Fox because I need to know what's going on there. And it's hard to do, right? It makes me angry. My wife often leaves the room. She can't, at some point. But it's important that we have some sense of what is being covered here, what's not being covered here, what's the argument, what are they saying? So again, it's difficult to be in those spaces, particularly when there's such emotionality taking place. But it's most important under those conditions that we try to encourage ourselves to tolerate that.
You talked about science, and we're in New England, and it's close to Halloween, so I want to see if I can get you to talk about witchcraft a little bit. You talk, a witch was somebody who was in league with or possessed by a spirit, allegedly, right?
Right.
And I wonder if, apropos of your comments about Fox News and MSNBC, is there an element where this ever so pervasive and ever more seductive and ever more influential media has, in effect, is the devil making us do this? Do you have any insight? Because really, you talk about qualitative changes.
Yeah.
The impact of these media is
Well, my first association, I'll talk about the media, but my first association is we did some work in Mozambique. And Mozambique was a Portuguese colony for hundreds of years, and then there was an independence war, and then they had a terrible civil war for 16 years where their groups fought each other. And it was horrible, and there were all kinds of atrocities on both sides. And then there was a peace process that happened pretty quickly. It was kind of surprising, and I can talk about it. In fact, I write about it in this book. It was a quick shift to peace. And afterwards, the people when you would talk to them about what happened, like how did it change, they described what happened to them as that a bad wind had blown in and had taken over the spirits of the people, and it really shaped their attitudes and opinions and their behaviors for 16 years, and that the wind blew out. But somehow they needed to understand it as something bigger than them, something almost natural but perverse that controlled them. And yeah, I think so. So there's the book that came out about 5 years ago called The Big Sort, and it looks at how the internet and the algorithms in the internet are sorting us to our likes and away from our dislikes, and therefore sorting our news interests and sorting the echo chambers that exist. And so there was a fair amount of speculation that is the core thing that's driving the polarization. A recent paper that came out suggests that it might not be that, because still recently, there's only something like 8 to 10% of our news is acquired through social media. So it's still a fairly small percent, but 40-some% is television media, and still 35% is news media, which I was very impressed to see, right? I was surprised to see that, frankly. So about 45%, the biggest piece is television media. And I was saying one of the surprising culprits of the current state of our television news was 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes was the beginning of the end of good news. Because 60 Minutes was really good and was really successful and started to attract sponsors and became a cash cow for CBS. Before that, the news was something that they did as a public service. It was, it was about the news and integrity in reporting the news, but it wasn't about money, and it wasn't about entertainment, it was about the news. And since, it's a perverse effect of 60 Minutes, which I'm a big fan of, but what happened was the paradigm changed, and suddenly money got directly involved in news, and now there are 24-hour cycles, and even CNN has breaking news every 30 seconds, a new breaking news and a new breaking news. And it's about attention, but it's also about ratings and money, right? So there is this perverse effect. Fox News is a big part of it. It's the biggest news organization in the country right now. But the others as well are to some degree responsible for this, and they're trying to attract our attention. They're trying to keep us plugged in. And so the framing tends to become more sensational. And so that is to some degree creating a culture where we feel like we're more polarized than ever because we're told that we're more polarized than ever. And we hear these completely almost psychotic perspectives on the world that seem divorced from each other, right? But there's some intentionality to that. To some degree, we are being played by the media, by politicians who, by dividing us, can hold on to power and mobilize their own power, and by foreign governments who are enjoying these divisions and playing these divisions.
You know, you talk about breaking news, and we used to worry about the bull in the china shop. Now, if we had a Wolf Blitzer in the china shop, it would be breaking news all the time. Yeah. That's what happens when an actuary tells a joke.
That was an awesome example.
So I want to bring us down to the Amherst level. This is a pretty liberal place by and large. I've sat in a lot of critical connections meetings, and we actually named the series Transforming This Moment because there was just so much raw emotion on both sides that it was almost like a force of nature. And the idea would be if we can channel it, if we can harness it, if we can learn about it, we can do something with it. It's almost a shame to let this amount of passion, I'm 63, I don't have that much passion left in me, but I do now, to try to use this. But the dilemma here, I think, and this is a hard question. I think I speak for many of us. We feel that there are basic institutions at stake. That this is a time for courage. That we cannot turn our back. We have to go to the streets. We have to stand up for this stuff. But are we making it worse? Are we actually keeping civilization from sliding into the sea? Or are we actually perpetuating a conflict and intensifying a conflict and actually making it worse? It's a kind of a nuanced question, but
yeah. So again, it depends on what it is and how we do it, right? I think one of the mistakes that we on both sides make is that we see the other as a monolith. We see the conservatives as all alike, or they're all Trump supporters, or they're all thinking about the same things in the same ways, and we to some degree see our own groups that way. And as you can imagine, there are huge divisions in the Republican Party right now. There are huge divisions in the Democratic Party right now. So in some ways we're a more fractured country than we are a polarized country, and those divisions are becoming bigger and bigger, and equally as important. So I think one of the myths that we have to disabuse ourselves of is the idea that there are these pure camps, because there are a lot of divisions and there's a lot of common ground between these different groups. So that possibility exists. I guess part of what I want to say is that in service of change around the current climate, there's a short game and a long game. So one of the things I talk about in this book, and one of the things that's kind of odd about how attractors change, or how strong patterns in society changes, is that they don't change quickly, and they don't change in reaction to dramatic things. So let me give you an example. In 2011, there was this thing called the Arab Spring, right, which took place in North Africa and then some of the Middle Eastern nations. Syrian conflict started around then, Libya, Tunisia, elsewhere. And something happened that caused that. And there was a lot of speculation about, well, what was it that caused all of this tumult in this region? And some scholars argue that those kinds of things happened because of some major political shock that happened not right then, not just earlier, but about 10 or 15 years before. So what happened 10 years before 2011?
First Iraq War.
9/11, First Iraq War, Afghanistan incursion, major political shocks to the region, right, that had an impact on things. And so what does that mean? Does it mean that 9/11 and the American incursion caused the Arab Spring? No. It means that those things were destabilizing, and they led to changes which led to other changes, which led to other changes, and approximately 10 years later, you see these dramatic things take place. This is pretty common when people study. There are two political scientists, Paul Deal and Gary Getz, who study this thing called the Correlates of War database. It's a 200-year-long database of state-to-state relationships. And what they find is that these difficult, long-term, more intractable divides, like what's happening in Washington, D.C., most of them, 95% of those kinds of conflicts, are preceded approximately 10 years before with some major political shock. And those shocks occur, and then you see these things occur. So our current divisions in Washington, some would argue that they started with Reagan. They started in about 80, 81, and that's when these voting patterns started to deviate. But 10 years before Reagan, a lot of stuff happened in this country, right? It was the end of the 60s and early 70s. There was Vietnam War, there was anti-establishment, there was Roe v. Wade. There were assassinations of political figures in our country. Major cultural political shocks, and about 10, 12 years later, you see this thing start to kick in. So all of that is illustrative of is that change happens in weird ways around these kinds of patterns, right? Donald Trump is, if amongst other things, is a rupture. He's a rupture to American politics. He's a rupture to our culture. He is, for better or worse, and it's going to move in both directions, folks, he is radically changing things. So it's very likely that there will be big changes happening. They may not happen as quickly as we think, but what we do need to do is start to prepare the ground so that it doesn't just reinforce divisions, but that it provides an opportunity for us to reorganize. And one way to do that is really just, again, recognize the divisions within these groups, because there are a lot of divisions within both progressive and liberal groups. But psychologically, one of the things we've found is it starts with us recognizing the divisions within ourselves. So there's research by Sonia Rokas and Madeline Brewer, an Israeli and an American, who study what they call social identity complexity. And what they find is that those of us whose identities match up, so our political identities, I'm green, I'm pro-choice, I'm Democrat, I'm progressive, all of these things line up. When we hold these more consistent attitudes about our own group affiliations, then we're very, very intolerant of outgroups. But when we're gay and Republican, when we're green and financially conservative, when we hold these internal divisions, which you can see are happening less and less, but when we not only hold them, but just recognize them, because the fact is, we all never act in ways consistent with our values and our beliefs, right? We're always deviating from them. We don't necessarily pay attention to them or admit them. But the more we recognize those, they find, the more tolerant we are of people who are different from us. And that's where it can begin psychologically, just with us and recognizing our own contradictions. But the point I was trying to make in terms of long-term and short-term is, Trump is an aberration, and Trump needs to be fought, and the institutions are fortunately holding, and the legal system and the media is really coming to bat in this era, and so some of these institutions are really functioning well, and we do need to protest, and we need to fight the fight when necessary. But we have to do it in a way where we don't burn bridges and further alienate the other side. Because big changes are coming, and they can be changes for the better. They can be changes where we regroup, or they can just harden these divisions that have been with us since 1980 and move us further apart and make us further, more and more dysfunctional. So I think it's a pivotal time. And it's a hard time to be tolerant, and it's a hard time to reach across, but there are things that we can do to more effectively engage that way.
And I think apropos of that, the idea looking at the changes in ourselves and starting to model the change that we want to see happen. We're coming on this holiday that we call Thanksgiving, and a lot of people know, but a lot of people don't know that it was Abraham Lincoln in the midst of the Civil War who came up with the idea of Thanksgiving as a unifying holiday. And so hopefully, as you came in, you picked up this sheet. Dr. Coleman and group have put together sort of 10 ways to get through the holidays.
Prepare yourself.
Prepare yourself. And it sounds a little fanciful and maybe comical, but not at all. Because I think these, I don't know what we can exactly do about Washington, no matter which side you're on. But I have my sister, and I'm 63 and she's 60, and we are an intractable problem, and I have not solved that yet. And it does mirror these lines. So maybe if you could just take us through a few of these, and then I think Ginny is gonna break us up into some small groups, and we'll have some conversation and come back.
So what these are cherry-picked social science. These are all basically evidence-based pieces of ideas for you to chew on. The first, I start by just saying, if you're feeling highly anxious about having these conversations, good, because we're in a high anxiety time. We're in this media frenzy time. We are in this time where threats to our climate change, threats to our security are exacerbated by the media, and we are afraid to sit down with people and try to have, conversation with people with whom we have a history. So feeling anxious makes sense. Being mindful of the emotional components of this, that facts and figures aren't going to get you very far. But I think more importantly, so one of the things we learned from complex systems, from the study of complex systems, is that when you start a new system, you start a new organization, a new institution, or you return home to start things anew, you can try to reset. It is an opportunity to reset. It is an opportunity to try to take things in a different direction. So you have a history, you have strong dynamics, you know that, and you can predict what's going to happen. But you can attempt to derail that and to start something else, to start a different kind of conversation in a different way. And it depends on you to do that, because otherwise everybody's going to fall in line the way we typically do. So there is this kind of unique opportunity that you face, but it only will happen if you believe that they and you can change. So there's a theory that has been tested in the Middle East, which is people's implicit theories about conflict and about the other. And what they find with Israelis and Palestinians is when you have Israelis who believe that the other isn't going to change, the situation isn't going to change, this has been all my life, it's going to be all my life. If that's your belief system, then that's exactly what happens, because you feel more animosity towards the other, less willingness to engage, less hope. But if you have a belief that, well, maybe future generations will change, maybe there'll be a shift, maybe there's that possibility. If you hold that belief, then you tend to engage better, negotiate better, be more open to information from them, be less hostile, less anxious about the outgroup, right? So the dynamics change based on that simple belief. So it is, as hard as it might be, if you have a history with someone, if you can believe in the possibility of a change, that they might change, you might change, the situation might change. I mean, we've not always been in this time. This is a new time, and it's a radically different time than I've experienced in my entire life. So definitely the times will change, right? And so if you can hold on to that, it can set you up for a different kind of conversation. But if you can't, then you'll get more of the same. So there are, 10 different ideas that we pose here that, as I said, come from a lot of the literature. Some of it is the simple idea that we see what we look for. Mm-hmm. So if we have an attitude about Trump and we watch television, we either see him bumbling and being a fool and being worse, a fascist, or we see the extraordinary things that he does. Right? People see those things. So, and these are called confirmation bias processes. These are well-defined psychological processes that we see what we look for. And part of it is situated in our attitudes and how we feel about the object, but we look for things that confirm those things actively. It's something that we're hardwired to do, and if we're mindful of those, we can attempt to at least believe in the possibility of change and shifts. Yes? So now what do we do?
So I think Jimmy, well, I just want to say you have a vision, which is we've had war break out all over the place, and you have a vision of peace breaking out all over the place. So if we see this little ripple of peace breaking out from Amherst and spreading across,
that would be awesome.
We will know if this has been worth the pizza that was expended tonight. Ginny, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you.
You got that?
My name is Jenny McKenna, and I'm on the board of Karuna Center, which is the other institution that comes together to make these evenings happen. I study our mission statement because, as some of you know, it took a long time to come to. So the simplest way to say what we do is we bridge divides to build sustainable peace. And a piece of our belief is that that will be its best if we can build the differences into the peace, that the divisions can bring us greater strength. They don't only have to be something we have to jump over. So that's my wrap on Karuna, and my job up here tonight, one of the things we believe in is conversation and dialogue. So we're going to ask you to turn to the people around you, groups of 2 or 6 or whatever you choose, and we're going to ask you to consider a question that actually has, in my mind, 2 parts. So I would begin by asking you to think of a time you were in a conversation that you expected to be intractable, and in fact you felt some glimmer of opening, a glimmer of an idea. You felt a particular openness yourself in that moment that was unexpected. And stop and think, if you can, about what made that happen. And I'm going to read the language, the prepared language, which is, what are the factors that help or hinder in those moments the conversations with people from across the divide? So if you'll start with thinking of a time you felt yourself cross the divide, and then analyze for a minute with each other what you think the factors were that helped. That's what we'd like to do. Then I'll make a noise in a few minutes and ask you to come back together, and we'll have a period of questions and answers, stump the speaker time. It's pretty exciting stuff. It's always hard to bring groups back at this kind of conversation. So I'm really looking forward to the question and answer period. I think we've got a lot of material to work with. But before we do, a former board member who's in the group had an idea that she wanted to speak about before we move to question and answer. So I'd like to give the mic to her for a minute, and then I'll pick up. So be thinking about your questions as you listen.
Thanks. One of the phenomenon is when there's a power turnover, the people who used to have the power can often be demonized. So that happened in Middle Ages with women who were healers. So much of the healing was happening with herbalists. And when the turnover came where men took over the position of healing doctors, the name Wicca, which means wise, suddenly there was a whole demonization of that group of people. So I wanted to just correct that picture. So it isn't true that Wicca had to do with healing. So 5 million women were killed. And so I think it's really important that we see the whole idea of witches in a more factual way.
Sarah, tell people who you are.
My name is Sarah Purtle, and I'm an interfaith minister.
Thank you, Sarah. So does anyone have a question you want to try out? Yes. Oh, instead of handing the mic around, we're going to ask you to speak up because the acoustics are pretty good in here.
Or just come to the mic.
Or come. If you can't speak up, come forward.
I'll speak up.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It seems
to me as if perhaps one of the issues that we're divided on has to do with some people wanting things like tolerance and cooperation and peace, accepting difference, and that it's okay to disagree, and that some other people seem to want disruption and bullying and using force to get your way, and that difference is bad, and that disagreeing is not allowed. Do you see that as one of these conflicts, and so is it an intractable one, or how do you deal with that if your belief is on one side of it?
Well, I only see it as an intractable conflict if it's something that has persisted for a long period of time and there have been attempts to remedy it, whatever attempts. Sometimes those attempts are by the police, by the justice system, or through dialogue and other kinds of processes, and they don't respond to those things. So again, I think if there is bullying, if there is if there are illegal acts that are taking place, I think that the appropriate responses to those are to fight them, and to fight them legally, and to take them on directly. It's only when these two areas that you just described, one you described as sort of tolerant and cooperative and open, the other is closed and hostile, and if those really become camps, I mean, I don't see the conservative movement as that camp. I do associate Trump's tactics, Bannon's tactics with that, and I think that's a subgroup within this group. I think there are a lot of different reasons that people are pro-Trump or supported Trump, and I think we have to hold on to that nuance, because I don't think that they all fall into this category. So to me it is the oversimplification of a group, either group or any group, that becomes part of the problem. I have to say that I have a close colleague named Andrea Bartoli, who is an Italian anthropologist, and he worked with a group called the Community of San Egidio. This is a Roman Catholic group who, they mostly do anti-poverty work all around the world, but because they're in places, sometimes they do peace work because people trust them, because they're there and they're doing the right thing. And they have, for years, done this very provocative thing, which is that they reach out to the worst of the worst in the international community. So for years, they would try to reach out and have contact with Osama bin Laden. And they would find ways to try to get calls to people in his network. And they would call, and he would tell this to my students, and my students would say, well, what do they say when you call? And then he said, well, they hang up. he said, and then we call back, a month later and say, I was the guy that called last month. And he said, we can do that. The president can't do that, Secretary of State can't do that. We can do it because it plants the possibility that something could change. And in fact, their history shows, in Mozambique in particular, that they were able to, in a situation where you had people in the bush violently planning to kill each other, they were able to have conversations with people which planted a different idea that led to a different idea and a different action and ultimately to peace. So they argue that they can do that. Not everybody can do that, but those that can are a source of hope.
Who's next? Yeah?
I want to share two sources of hope, one insight and a resource. The hope is Ireland, Northern Ireland, and South Africa.
Yeah.
We've seen things that when I was a teenager we would never have believed possible.
That's right. Yeah.
The insight is that if we can find one point of agreement and slowly work out from it, it's a lot easier to do these dialogues, and it's much easier if food is involved. And the resource, you're probably familiar, there's a book by Adam Kahane called Power and Love. You would definitely want to read that one. It's about how, in order to have a movement for social change, and this is a guy that's worked in the Middle East and worked in South Africa, worked in all sorts of intractable places. that if you have only love, then you can't make the change because you're not strong enough. And if you have only power, you can't make the change because you leave hell in your wake.
Yeah.
But when you have both, you make the change.
Yeah, yeah, I like it.
Thank you. I saw a hand over there. Yes?
I guess this is a little bit complicated, but I feel as though one of the most important aspects of what's happening now, certainly in Amherst and maybe in the country, is the inability to explore our inner conflicts or any places where we might understand or empathize with the other, because they're so evil. And we have grown more and more into seeing aspects of ourselves and our own feelings as being negative. I mean, I actually shared here, and will share that in my anti-racism work, gradually beginning to recognize over a long period of time more and more some of the ways in which I was frightened or was recognizing my own racist attitudes and white supremacy myself, and the conflicts, the self-hatred, and this complexity in this moment when we're polarizing, they're bad. If we can't begin, the more we say they're bad, the harder it is for us to experience the aspects of ourselves that have any human relationship or identification with what they're screaming about. And I just wish that we could do more work on those places of empathy, of understanding, of listening, and less on changing minds.
Yeah, let me just say that I know that you've had a former Nazi or neo-Nazi and a former Muslim extremist, I think, and pretty common in their stories. I've met a former skinhead who had a similar story in his transformation, which was that oftentimes, and we've actually studied this, oftentimes people will change eventually because of some serendipitous thing that happened, sometimes when they were younger or years before, that just put enough doubt in their certainty about the evil, right? So, of course, extremist skinheads see the other as objects of their hate. They don't have humanity, they don't have those things. And then something happens, and one skinhead was saying he was a skinhead in a rock band, and he would drink all night, and he showed up at work one day, and he said a black coworker took his submarine sandwich, broke it in half, and said, "Hey, Skin," and threw it at him. And he said he caught it, and he said, first of all, he felt a sense of contempt, but he was really hungry. So he ate the sandwich, and there was something about that act that he couldn't reconcile with the certainty of his point of view. And so sometimes it's not even a sense of compassion or empathy, it's really just a sense of doubt in the certainty of the other being so awful or us being so great that can begin the unraveling. And he described it took time, it didn't happen right away, it was very nonlinear, but it led to other things and other things. There's a young woman, I can't remember her last name, her first name is Megan. She was raised in the Westboro Baptist Church,
Yeah, the TED Talk.
Well, I don't know the TED Talk, I met her.
Okay.
Yeah, she came to speak to me for some reason, and she told a story of that kind of thing happening. That she was raised in this place that had a lot of clarity and certainty. Her whole family was part of the community. They were very provocative in their protestation, right? And at some point, there was something in Matthew 7 that was a direct contradiction with the hostile things that they were doing in their protest. And she talked to all of her friends, and they said, "Don't worry, the elders will explain it to us. I'm sure that there's a logical reason to it." And she went home and said to her dad, "We do these things, and yet Christ said this, and he said, 'You're right, that's a contradiction.'" She said that was it. And then another contradiction and another contradiction, and all of the certainty of her world, the world isn't a certain place ever, unraveled, and about 6-8 months later, she and her sister left her whole life, right? And so it is sometimes these surprising little pieces of doubt that affect our certainty of how good we are and how evil they are that is the beginning of the unraveling.
The previous speaker, whom I know, Nancy, raised something which I came across in two situations very recently. I'm a mediator and I'm from South Africa, and I've gone through the apartheid as well as the new transition, and I'm trying to incorporate the lessons of the Truth and Reconciliation in my work here for the last 19 years in the US. When last week in a session, someone who is on the far left in this group would shout, this whole thing about white supremacy and blah, 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 blah. And then the next day, as we were doing listening exercises around pro-con issues, and if I'm the 80% against you, the 20%, how do we have that conversation? And she said, I realized that my muscles of empathy have not been developed. As a child, I didn't get it. And up till now, I didn't get it. But I recognize now that I need to develop my empathy muscles. And that was a shift for her in that session. Second exercise was with another group around the Trump issue in a church, deeply divided. I worked with them last week, and there was extreme yelling in the room. And last night again, we did an exercise around listening. How do we really listen to the one we are in opposition with? And they are all there in their real differences in that room. And last night, I could feel the calmness as they were doing the real listening with one another, how there was mutual understanding. So my question to you is, as I'm listening to the short and the long range issues and time periods we have to be aware of in what's been happening in this country and what's been happening in my country. 20 years before the new South Africa, we started, while the country was burning, we started working around training ourselves in mediation, and I'm sure you are aware of that. And then when it happened, it was a shock for us. It was unexpected when Mandela was released and the liberation movements were released, but at least at some level, we started preparing ourselves whether the change would come or not. So the question is, where are we in this country now? What do you see happen at various levels, preparing ourselves not just to resist, but to sit together? What are the processes that are already happening, and what do you envision could happen so we can help ourselves? I feel like I'm seeing it on these local levels, and also with my work in Palestinians and Israelis. What do we need to do to be ready and to come together?
Well, so thank you for your question and for your comments, and I guess just 2 points I want to make. One is this issue of empathy. Empathy is a very hard thing to do under these conditions. It's certainly easier to have empathy for certain members of the other side, and it's really hard to have empathy for some. There was a man named Ralph White who was a peace psychologist, and he coined a phrase he called realistic empathy. And realistic empathy is not necessarily feeling deep compassion for the other side, but it's really recognizing the need to understand what is going on with them, right? So McNamara, when he was Secretary of State, was involved in the escalation of the Vietnam War, and he eventually did a documentary film called The Fog of War about 5-10 years ago, where he recounted that, and he described the delusion that he was in because he assumed the enemy was a certain thing and really wasn't paying attention. And he said his first learning was empathize with your enemy. the more that you can have a realistic sense of understanding of what's going on. First of all, it de-escalates our own sense of self-righteousness, but the other thing it does is it brings in information, important information, right? If we assume they're evil, that's what we're going to elicit, and that's what we can expect, and the dynamic will take off. So having some degree of realistic empathy is a place to start, even when there's a sense of, real suspicion and disdain. Regarding the other issue about what you do, there was I wish I knew who this author was. There was a journalist for The Atlantic that last year, before the election, was flying around the country and going to local places.
James Fallows.
Sorry?
James Fallows.
James Fallows, thank you. And he said an extraordinary thing, as he was saying that, Washington is boondoggled, is polarized, is shut down, is dysfunctional. But he was noting that local community work was actually highly functional, right? That in many communities across this country, you had political systems that were functioning pretty well. And so I do think that there are local grassroots movements, there are local grassroots communities like you all. I was talking to a gentleman about this earlier, that there are grassroots organizations, Public Conversations Project, National Issues Forum, Seeds for Search for Common Ground. There are community-based focused organizations that do this, and they are one of the institutions that are rising to the demand, that are recognizing that this is a tenuous time, a difficult time. It can go really poorly, and it is a time to bring community members together across differences and have those conversations. This gentleman was talking about a group called Better Angels. So there are more and more of these coming up that it's important to be mindful of, because Washington is really stuck, and they're really, for a variety of reasons. Some of it's media, some of it's gerrymandering, right? I read a statistic that in 1976, 25% of the country lived in counties that were landslide counties where everybody voted the same. In the last election, it's 50%. So half of the voting population are living in these places, and that's largely due to gerrymandering, right? How we're being manipulated and organized. So there are real structural problems that are going to keep Washington as dysfunctional as it is for a while. It really is a time to have communities rise up and do the work that we need to do, that we can do, that maybe we're better suited to do, right? So in some ways, it's an opportunity. It's a hard opportunity, but an opportunity, yes.
I want to speak to exactly what you're talking about,
Yep.
Because my community's taking some action along these lines. I live in Leverett, which is right next door.
Yep.
We're a very progressive community. There's a handful of Trump people there.
Yep.
But we were very depressed, shocked, angry after the election, and we actually had a town meeting to talk about this and maybe take some action. And one of the ideas that we came up with was to create a partnership relationship with some community in Trump land. If we could reach out and find somebody out there in Nebraska, Tennessee, wherever.
Right.
And we have been successful. We have made a connection with Letcher County, Kentucky, which is in the heart of coal country. It's in Appalachia. They're very poor. They went 80-20 Trump. We were exactly the opposite. The upshot of it is that a group from Kentucky, regular citizens, mostly Trump people, they're coming up here next weekend for 3 days of culture and dialogue, cultural exchange and dialogue.
Wow.
Sarah here has written a wonderful song in honor of this event. It's a beautiful song, brings tears to your eyes.
I'd love to hear it.
Then in the spring, a group from our community are going to go down to Kentucky in an exchange, and we'll hear bluegrass and tour their area. And everything's been very positive so far. And everything you're talking about, empathy, we're learning. We have great facilitators who will be participating in the dialogue. Empathy, good listening.
Singing and dancing.
Singing and dancing and dining and eating.
Yeah.
All the things you're talking about, we're going to try to implement those.
Well, I think there are some unintended consequences of this extraordinary time, and I do think to some degree, as I was saying, the rise of the media, the rise of the power and the importance of the media today, in some ways the investigative journalism components have really, are coming to meet the task. Communities, the same thing. There are many stories like that. I mean, I think that's a beautiful story and an extraordinary opportunity. for you to learn and for them to learn and to try to bridge this gap. These are not easy things, and no one or two of these are going to make the difference. What is going to make the difference is a groundswell of these kinds of things, where you do see, ironically, in some nations, Nepal is one of them, you have so much dysfunction at the national level that it actually serves communities to stay distant from them and to have their own peace processes. When they can be very effective and successful, and the more the federal government comes down, the more they say, no, thank you, we're good, So sometimes these have ironic effects like this of mobilizing communities to do things that, I was saying that I grew up I went to college in the 1980s when we were apathetic. Apartheid was happening and we were mindful of it, but we were not a mobilized youth population at that time. Our country was pretty apathetic, unlike, the generation before. And this is, my son is in school near here, and he's been to multiple marches. He's engaged, he's acted, he's activated. I think it's, unintended positive consequences of this extraordinary time. So I think that's the hopeful response to this, is examples like that are happening anyway, and that can be supported more and more.
And so everyone knows, and this initiative is called Hands Across the Hills. And while it's a dialogue group between the Kentucky-based group and the Leverett-based group, there is going to be a public component to it next Saturday. And if you like our Facebook page, you'll find more information on that, even though it's not a Critical Connections event at all. But,
Hands Across the Hills?
Yes.
Does it called?
Hands across the hills.
Do we have another question? Yes.
Yes, you touched upon the fact that empathy can lead to open up understanding, but speaking concretely about the most divisive conflicts in this country now, that are morally divisive around those clusters, you said, a certain set of issues clustered together. Well, is there any basic thing that is not understood between those groups that calls out for understanding? And how, and what is that? How are they to understand one another? Do they understand one another? My experience is they don't, and they're basic things. Why does right to life go with support for military, for example, going back to the, these people are crazy, but not from their standpoint. So they're meant, what can be done to, and is that an important
it's very important
vehicle for bridging?
So there was a great film that came out last year called The Armor of Light. You would hear of this? Made by a filmmaker named Abby Disney. And she initially set out to make a film about the NRA and the history of the NRA and how it's been sort of co-opted by the gun industry. And ultimately what happened in the process of it is that she met a man named, Rob. He is an evangelical minister, Rob Schenck. He's an evangelical minister for Congress. And he is an extreme pro-life advocate. He's protested in very, very provocative ways. And she met him in the process of making this film. And she put that question to him. How can you be pro-life and be pro-gun? And what's the deal with that marriage in the evangelical community? And that in the process of making the film, Rob Schenck wakes up and starts to say, and this is sort of unfolds in the film. He's not the only person in the film, but he's a central figure. And he starts to recognize that these are, in some ways, irreconcilable values. And he starts to come out to his community, to the evangelical community, jeopardizing his career, his life, everything he stands for, because he really sees that there is this unbelievable discrepancy in these two things that have somehow been married. And they've used this film now. It's a great film. I would recommend it. It just won an Emmy, I think, last week for the best documentary of something, social impact documentary, I think. And they use the film in screenings like this with evangelical communities to talk about this issue, because it's not an issue that was discussed. It's been kind of accepted as these things go together, as part of this combination. So there are ways of having those conversations, and this is a particularly dramatic and compelling illustration of that kind of division that can happen. But they use that as a stimulus to just have conversations. And the filmmaker and Rob have been traveling the country to kind of have these kinds of conversations, in some ways to peel those issues apart.
That's assuming that they're wrong, but they're not going to. And I mentioned military, support for military. There's a reason that they go together for those people, and
That what goes together?
Right to life and support for military strength and our soldiers.
Well,
they both represent duty.
Let me say one thing. So there was a fantastic editorial in the Times last week by someone writing about writing to the left, saying that if gun regulation people want to really mobilize communities, they should learn from the NRA. And what the article argued, this was a progressive man writing this who had been an activist for gun control. And he said, when I was contacted and when I got involved in this, I got involved and was told, we need you to give some money, here's some phone numbers to call, we need you to make some calls, and we need you to write some letters. He said, when you look at what the NRA has done, they are tapping into a sense of belonging, identity, and community. Do you know that there are more gun clubs in this country than McDonald's? More gun clubs than McDonald's. And gun clubs are places where they come together in community. They can shoot their gun and talk guns. But part of it is that they're part of a community and they're part of an identity. And the identity, is framed as protecting a way of life, right? So part of what this person was arguing is that mobilization and community organization is really imbalanced. Part of it is because of how that's done, and it's done by tapping into a sense of identity and meaning and purpose and connection to other people in a society where we're very increasingly disconnected from other people. And they've been using that for decades to organize communities in ways that are very powerful, in ways that the left hasn't quite figured out yet. So part of it is the strategy, but part of it is what does this mean to people? And that's what I mean by realistic empathy. Because the more we understand that, the more that we can have a conversation that perhaps is respectful of that, because those are things that we all need and that we all long for. And this particular subgroup has organized around that. So they have conferences with 80,000 people. When have you seen a gun regulation conference with 80 people, right? So there is part of it is an imbalance in the strategy, but part of it is what it's tapping into. And it is tapping into things that are resonant in this country: a need to connect, a need for identity, and a need for purpose.
I just want to say that I'm appreciating everything you're saying. And in that list, I think one big one that's being left out, which I think Trump is the master of, and that's fear.
Yeah.
And you just said protecting a way of life.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's that. And then I'm also in dialogue for 12 years now with my brother-in-law, who's a born-again fundamentalist evangelical Christian with a lesbian daughter. And that's how we started, because she came out and he said, if you don't go to conversion therapy, you lose your car and your college. And she didn't, and she did. So we've been emailing for 12 years. I thought about trying to get it into a book. I have to get his permission, obviously. But we have basically the fundamental, that's a dangerous word, I know, the basic bottom line that we have been able to do this around, because we've talked about everything from gun control and abortion to the NFL taking a knee. And we've disagreed 99.9% of the time. But except for one or two emails, it's been done respectfully. And I think that, to me, because I think I'm super glad you can have these conversations. And my relationship with them is based on love. We love each other. We have enormous respect for each other as people in our families, people who love our children, with this big glaring hole. But I do believe that he's sincere,
Yeah.
that he's representing himself authentically.
Yeah,
But
and
he
for
had-
him, that was a gesture of love.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but he has
Yeah.
enormous fears. He's afraid of people taking his guns. That's
Yeah.
where that starts out with the NRA. He even sent me a fake news story about Obama was going to take all the bullets. He wasn't going to go after the guns anymore. He had a story that was going to happen. He just sent one this week about 2 pilots that said they weren't going to fly back the New Orleans Saints because they took a knee from England when they played the game there.
Uh-huh.
So I go online and we find out this is not a true story.
Right.
And then he'll apologize. I say, I should have looked more closely.
Okay.
But then he'll say, I wish it was true. But that's because I think this divide, especially with the evangelicals, because they're predicating everything on a fundamentalist reading of this Bible. I can't find, if I point out a contradiction, he'll just, he'll find something else.
Yeah.
That's not going to be the basis for that kind of change.
Well, it may
I've
not-
stopped trying to change them. I'm just trying to have the dialogue
Right.
and keep it going as best I can. Take breaks sometimes when it gets too
Yeah.
intense.
I mean, again, I think you should be commended for staying in it and engaging, and he as well. It is an extraordinary thing, and clearly there is love there that's sustaining it. The change may not come from you. It may come from something else, but it also could be something that's happening that's working on him in some ways that we don't understand, so you might still see something. You never know.
But my goal is to accept that he might not change.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't mean to give you false hopes. Yeah. Right, yes.
I want to thank you for all the points that you listed, and I've studied a lot of mindfulness in meditation communities, and so it's really about looking deeply and listening deeply and not being caught in rightness or identities.
Yeah.
And that being said, and his point about fear, and what I was really thinking is, sometimes I think it's really good to have curiosity about what are the vulnerabilities that people are holding. So I think that NRA thing, the seed of it, I'm not saying where it is now because it's very corrupted and exploiting, but there are a lot of people that have real fear of something being taken away.
Sure.
Same thing with Israeli Palestinians. There's these myths that get crystallized by the other person.
Yeah.
But there's that vulnerability and to ask the questions and trying to connect, because we all have our vulnerabilities. And anyways, it's a softer place to kind of enter into.
Yeah, and I do want to underscore his point about fear and your point about loss. I think 83% of Trump voters felt like the country is broken and not serving them. 20-some% felt that way for Hillary. So there is a real discrepancy in people who feel left behind. They can't make it work. They can't make it work for their kids. There's a deep frustration that's part of what's happening here. And there's the manipulation of fear. And that's the oldest game in politics. It works, right? Negative ads work in politics. Fear works in politics. Demagogues have done it for, millennia. So it definitely is something primitive that comes into play. Fear in our brain stem, fear triggers first. Fear is the most powerful thing. It is something that is the most primitive emotion. The other kinds of emotions of hope and possibility come a little bit later, right? So we are hardwired to be sensitive to that. And it has been effectively manipulated before Trump. Remember the color codes around post 9/11 color codes? Phil Zimbardo, who's a social psychologist, did a whole tour about that because he said, so what exactly do you do when it goes from red to orange to red? And do we get like duct tape and what do we do? There's nothing to do other than feel anxious. And so his argument was that the administration was manipulating our anxiety in order to promote certain kinds of policies, right? And Trump is just more clumsier about it. He's just more obvious about it. He doesn't have a color code system, he just tweets. So, yes.
Norma.
Let's see. I'm going to start at the end. The Vietnamese American author Viet Thanh Nguyen talks about some cemetery, military cemetery he went to, that memorialized the enemy's war dead, as well as their own nation's war dead. So I'm thinking, I think about a particular subset of empathy.
Yeah.
It's a little complicated, but I was also on the board of the Karuna Center, and there's a notion about a cycle of violence that was written about by Olga Bacharova. Yeah. You know, she talks about like colonial power elevates Group A. Colonial power leaves. You know, Group A to the harm of Group B.
Right.
They leave, then Group B starts seeking revenge on Group A, and her idea about the way to break the cycle really has to do with mourning and recognition of the losses and the pain on both sides. So I guess my question is, have you come across anything like that? Because I also feel like, you know, memorializing our war dead and your war dead really throws lines back to legacy and identity and my history, and is very, very powerful. And I just wondered if you had encountered any of that kind of thinking.
Yeah, I think there is some kind of thinking on that around forgiveness and reconciliation. Jean-Paul Lederach is an author who's written a lot about reconciliation processes and the need for forgiveness and mercy and those kinds of things in order to incorporate, to grow a we, you know, from an us and a them. So there is some powerful writing on that. I don't know if I've heard anyone study about an embracing of the enemy's past, certainly of the past, and of finding ways of working that. And there are, I mean, Truth and Reconciliation was an attempt, flawed as it was, I met Paul Van Ziel, who was executive director, of that group, and he's talked very eloquently about the benefits of that, the challenges to that, the consequences of it, and subsequent Truth and Reconciliation processes that have attempted to mirror it, and, riff off of it basically, and find other more local ways of addressing the past. And oftentimes, like in divided communities like this, there is so much culpability that goes beyond the violence. It's the people that benefited from apartheid, and then there's this country. I remember Paul Van Ziel standing up and saying, because there were people criticizing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and he said, yeah, how's it going with slavery and the genocide of the indigenous Americans here? He said, have you guys figured that out here? And what exactly have you done? And that is an extraordinary American challenge, I think. I've never met Bill Clinton. I've always wanted to meet Bill Clinton because for several years he had a panel on race relations that he held that never culminated in anything. There was never a report. There was never a legislation, nothing, and I thought, so was that a political decision? It was too hot, so these kinds of things about reparations and forgiveness and reconciliation of the past, it's something that Americans are not particularly, we're all about the future. We're plugged into the future, but our past haunts us, it haunts us every day, and it's not something that we're particularly effective at. But there definitely are models of reconciliation that really see that as central. And you see it in other societies much more effectively than you do here.
But my mother received $20,000 reparations.
Oh, that's interesting.
As somebody who had to, who left to California.
Very interesting,
Yeah, you talked about the future. There's also a case that can be made about not as much controlling the future and allowing things to happen. We do the work, we do the inside work, so we get calmer. We do the dialogues, the hymns across the hills, the conversation on a cruise boat. But then, ultimately, it's events that change people. For instance, you take Trump voters. A lot of it comes from jobs, manufacturing jobs, or there's a feeling of being left behind, as you shared. But what if events don't happen that way? The jobs don't come back. What if the health insurance spikes? Now we don't choose that, but there's a certain sort of, it doesn't mean you don't do the activism, you work hard, but not be as attached to the tendency to control events. Events have a way of, you talked about the serendipity, things kind of flow.
Sure.
So it's I feel a more sort of balanced way, not get triggered by words, not try to call each other names. It's a little more, so we can have civilized dialogues, but fully realize, in my opinion, again, it's events that change people, never words.
Yeah, I agree with you to a point. I guess I have to say that I do feel like things are too complex to control in this country, in this world, particularly these major political trends. But I do think that there's something that a social psychologist named Albert Bandura calls, I think he calls it managing serendipity, that you can do certain things that increase the probability that maybe some good things happen and fewer bad things happen. So you can't necessarily cause this group to do X or Y, but you can place yourself in positions or choose not to place yourself in positions that can affect the future. And I think that is a healthy way to think about this time, because I do think that what we do matters for ourselves and our relationships and our communities, particularly with Washington as dysfunctional as it is. I don't think we can control the future. Some would argue that Trump is a backlash to Obama. Obama, was in some ways a response to Bush. We definitely swing back and forth in these ways. Some would argue it's a dialectic, that we're sort of moving through these things. Maybe that's true. But I do think the decisions we make in our life do matter in our local area, in little ways, and then they can bubble up in big ways, right?
Well, absolutely, we work hard.
Yeah.
But allow things to happen rather than a desire to.
Yeah, you can't.
Regardless, it's complex.
Absolutely, it's complex. It isn't ultimately controllable, but I think we can affect probabilities, and so I think we have. I think we have. I guess I'm just saying that I don't feel, I'm not fatalistic about this. I don't feel like it's a done deal and we're rearranging the deck chairs. I do think that there are things that we can do that can affect the probabilities down the road. It may not work out for all of us, but hopefully it'll work out for most of us.
You think of what happened in the 60s and 70s with the influence of the flower children, of the peace marchers, of the Malcolm X, that influenced the end of the Vietnam War. I was a teenager in the 60s.
Yeah.
Some of my friends went to Vietnam, some were conscientious objectors.
Yeah.
In my own family, had that divide. But it was people taking a stand that influenced change.
Yeah.
And it was at the grassroots, it was in our neighborhoods, it was in our houses. It was not.
Yeah, it was a combination of things, right? It was the news media covering it for the first time, which brought the immediacy of it to home and woke some of us up, right? So there was definitely a combination of things, but you're right. Protest mattered, the dissent mattered, public opinion mattered.
One thing that was the most striking in watching the Vietnam series, I don't know if any of you did, I watched every single episode, first night they came out. It was powerful. But I didn't realize, I think it was the 40s or the 50s, we were ready to be Ho Chi Minh's ally, to support their independence.
That's a very common story in our history.
Yeah.
We go back and forth.
McNamara changed his
We supported
The letter didn't get delivered.
I just looked up at the clock, which was kind of a boring thing to do in the middle of this interesting conversation. But we have made some time commitments here I'd like to uphold. So first I want to just say thank you, Peter. Thank you so much. And then I'd like to hand the mic to Lee, who's going to say goodnight and
Say goodnight. Say
goodnight.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming and contributing your insights and questions. And thank you again, Dr. Coleman. It was such a pleasure. And I hope you all have a great night. I think there might be some more pizza, so if there is, come and grab it if you want. Also, make sure to follow us on our Facebook page. We provide updates for our events, and we post really great articles, and so follow us there. Also, if you haven't signed up for our email mailings, please do so outside, and we look forward to seeing you at our future events. Thank you.